You might have seen the throwing of this angular vase in a previous video, but this week I'm catching up with the rest of the process, from the trimming, bisque firing, waxing, glazing, the final reduction firing, and doing one final bit of quality control on the finished object. But first, as always, this process begins with clay preparation. In this case, I'm using reclaim. This is stoneware that's been recycled, an accumulation of trimmings and scraps that are soaked in water into a fine slurry, then slathered on a plaster bat that draws out all the moisture, and once it resembles the condition of the clay you see here, it's peeled off the bat, wedged thoroughly, and then formed into that large block you saw at the start. And I apologise, as I didn't weigh out this piece of clay, so this vase is just going to be thrown from an arbitrary chunk I sliced off, but I imagine it's about 1.2 kilograms. I then spiral wedge the piece of clay a second time and ball it up, patting it into a nice round shape that once thrown against the wheel head will retain an even rounded shape, which makes centering easier, compared to say if I threw a squared off hunk of clay onto the metal. I use my index finger to seal the lump of clay against the wheel, soak it in water, and then begin the centering process. Now, my aim is to throw a very angular shape, so I need the clay to be in the very best condition, so I'm going to cone it up and down a couple of times to fully align the particles, the platelets, that make up the clay. You can get away not doing this for many shapes, but coning sort of acts just like an additional step of wedging, hopefully making the clay more plastic and thus easier to throw with. For simple pots like bowls and mugs, I don't normally do this, as if I have to cone up and down 50 lumps of clay, it adds a lot of making time to each piece, and generally I can just throw in away, where if a bubble or an undulation does appear, I can deal with it. Plus, if there is a bit of movement in those pots, I don't particularly mind, as I can just trim it away or finish the object whilst retaining that slight bit of movement. At the end of the day, small undulations are really only noticeable when the pot is spinning around quickly, like it is here. And generally speaking, once the pot has been finished and fired, you probably won't place it back onto the wheelhead to check. Plus, it is a handmade object, so I honestly don't mind if there are very subtle irregularities. As long as the pot has been finished to a high level in every other regard, I can live with it. With the lump of clay totally centered, the real shaping can begin, and that starts by opening the lump up, for which I use a thumb and index finger. I push them down, creating a V-shaped hollow, and once I feel it's deep enough, I can begin to spread the base out horizontally. I want the very bottom itself to be about 5 or 6 millimeters thick, and whilst I'm forming the base, I make sure to use plenty of water and slip, as it's during this opening stage where it can be so easy to introduce a wobble. Before I begin pulling up the clay properly, I first collar the walls inward, like so. This points the clay up in the direction I intend to pull it hereafter, whereas previously they were sort of splaying out slightly, and had I left them in that position, these subsequent pulls wouldn't be quite so easy to do. On the outside, I'm using a soaked mud tool sponge, which, with its nice rounded edges, is a wonderful tool to use on the outside to help pulling up with. It's soaked in water before each pull, and this way, as the sponge is pressed into the bottom and gradually lifted up, it keeps the walls lubricated, thus hopefully making each pull a bit more consistent and even. And the reason there's now an arrow on screen is just to mark a reference point, so that you can see the difference in the height of the walls before and after a pull like this. After each pull, to keep the shape consistent and to prevent it from splaying out too much, I collar the walls in, straightening them back into a cylinder. The soaked sponge scoops up clay at the bottom, presses it in, and then lifts it up. And on the inside, my left hand is pushing out where that bump is. The soaked sponge, you can also use your fingertips of course, then lifts this bump of clay all the way to the top in one smooth, consistent motion. And that's one of the most important things about doing this correctly. If instead, as you lift, your hands move quickly and then slowly, or stay in one spot for too long, you'll end up creating an inconsistency in the wall, one part either being too thick or too thin, or you can create throwing rings that are overly prominent. In all cases, this makes the following pulls more difficult, so keeping your movements consistent from bottom to top is one of the most fundamentally important parts of throwing pots successfully. With the walls now thinning out and feeling quite even from top to bottom, I'll begin to throw the rough angular shape of the body of the vase I'm making, and I'll purposefully be leaving the uppermost portion of the wall just very slightly thick. This way there's material to throw into the flaring shape further down the line. What you don't want at this stage is for the rim itself to be very thin and mean, as not only will you potentially not have enough material to work with later, but if the lip of the pot is wafer thin at this point, the vessel itself will be much weaker and will have the tendency to more easily lose its shape, compared to one that has some thickness left in the rim, as excess material in the lip helps to support the piece, bracing it and helping it maintain its shape. Now, before I begin throwing any harsh angles in the walls of the vase, I first scrape the outside free of slip and create a more rounded shape. I do this as a rounded form will hold its shape better than one thrown with a very distinct angle in it. And with a pot like this that I really want to belly out, if I were to throw that sharp corner in it at this stage, it can be very difficult to go back or to make any changes at all. So for the time being, whilst I'm still shaping the pot, I keep the waist rounded, and it's only later on in the process that I'll finish it more purposefully. Now, before I push the belly out any further, I'll first blast the outside with a heat gun. This gives the vessel a bit more strength and will stop the walls from splitting if I push them too much. And for the rest of this shaping, I'm pushing out against the metal kidney on the outside, still keeping the waist rounded, but pushing it out further than I could have previously done. I've now switched to a plastic kidney, simply as it doesn't catch quite so easily as the metal does, with the clay really quite thin here at this point, especially at the widest part as the walls have been stretched out. I want to minimise any potential errors that can occur. So by switching to the plastic tool, things should flow a bit more freely, so there's less of a chance I encounter any problems. With the vase about as wide as I want it, I can begin throwing and finishing the top, shaping the excess clay into the flared rim I want. So it's first thrown inward to create a more narrow opening. And then I can begin to pinch and angle this clay outward, with a finger held beneath the lip to support it. I then smooth and straighten the top side of the lip with a plastic kidney, and then neaten up the walls beneath this that lead up to it. And you'll have to excuse the soft focus on this next segment, which is the part where I throw the more angular section in the wall, which, with the amount I've dried it with the heat gun, feels like it's just a bit softer than leather hard. I can still shape it, but actually throwing it and moving the clay around at this point I think would be more or less impossible. The last step in the throwing is to scrape over all the edges to make sure they're lovely and sharp and refined. I'm hoping this pot won't need that much turning, but we'll see about that. I probably won't be able to help myself. Any excess water from the inside is then sponged out, as you don't want to leave too much slip or water in the bottoms of your pots as they dry out. Moisture left inside the pot overnight can weaken the walls and degrade the base. In extreme cases, it can cause the walls to split, the pot potentially collapsing. Otherwise, it may just keep the walls of your pot wetter for longer, meaning you might have to spend longer waiting for the pot to turn leather hard. Finally, a wire is dragged underneath the pot to separate it from the wheelhead, and then I lift it off and place it onto a bat. And from this point, I'll let the piece slowly turn leather hard over a day or two, most likely. I don't want to rush it, although I'm sure as this piece is so angular and sharp, it's bound to move a tiny bit as it dries, its shape altering just a touch, but hopefully not so much that I can't deal with it at the leather hard stage when I trim the vase. This bucket, by the way, is kept to my left at all times when I'm throwing. I can scrape slip off my hands against the sharp plastic edge it has, and I can also easily wash my hands without having to go to the sink. It's also where I clean my tools and throw any larger bits of clay that come off as I'm throwing. This way less clay goes down the sink. Even though I have a clay trap, this means I have to empty it less. Lastly, to keep this pot from drying out too much overnight, I'm going to simply cover it with a bucket, like so. This way no drafts hit it from one side, causing it to lean over slightly, and it certainly beats slinging some plastic sheeting over it, as that stuff can cling to pots and cause them to dry out more slowly You also need to be careful about removing it, as if it's drawn off too quickly or in the wrong way, it can damage the pot. Anyhow, it's a few days later now, and the piece is totally leather hard, although it does wobble a bit, as there was a cavity in the base that I ended up filling with clay, which I left proud, but I can now trim the base flat so the vase sits level as I trim the outside. And like I predicted, the pot is bobbling around quite a bit. You can see it in the walls of the pot here, clearly, but through trimming I will be able to fix this. With the base flattened, the vase is lifted away and placed on a skim of slip. Not too much, but enough. You don't want the pot hydroplaning over the wheelhead, but if you use too little slip, the vase simply won't stick. So whilst I might make this look very easy, there is a bit of a knack to it, and that's something I'll make a tutorial about soon, as there are so many small tips and tricks that make it a bit easier to do. For now though, the profile of this pot is straightened and sharpened. A touch of excess weight is removed from the walls, but there's really not much in them. I do need to be careful though about trimming away too much from this section of the vase, as when the vessel is upturned and I'm trimming the base, if this part is too thin, I think there's a chance the pot could sag, or the flared out section could potentially collapse under the weight of the vessel on top of it. So I won't trim away too much clay, and I'm going to constantly check this area with my fingers just to feel the cross section. If I feel like it's too thin, I'll give it a blast with the heat gun to dry the stoneware out and strengthen it. This way I can work on the base without having to worry about pushing down too firmly. As always, the vessel is pinned down in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, which in this case worked rather well as they overlapped the underside of the rim. I'm still using a spinner placed on top to push down through, but I'm being careful and I'm not exerting too much pressure through it as not to put too much stress on the rim section. Whilst trimming, I found a lump in the clay, which in fact turned out to be a small pebble. So it was carefully plucked out, and then I plug the hole with some wet clay and then scrape back over the area to correct the profile. I can then move my attention to the foot. I begin by trimming a nice flat, clean surface. Then I bevel the outer edge. This creates a point of contact that's less likely to chip with use, as this high iron clay that will ultimately be reduction fired is relatively brittle, and so if the base was finished with just a sharp right angle, the chance that that section would chip as the pot is put down and moved around is very high. And so with the foot well trimmed and the pot stamped, the vase is now placed onto an HPL bat, which is smooth so nothing imprints onto the base of the vessel, and from this point I'll slowly let the pot turn bone dry. This is the state we call pottery once all the moisture has left it, and it's only after this has happened that the pots can be bisque fired to 1000 degrees Celsius. As if you attempt to fire them when there's still moisture inside the walls, it will rapidly turn to steam, causing the pot to explode. It's not the air pockets that do it, it's the moisture, and as long as something is properly dry before firing it, you shouldn't encounter any problems. It's now a few days later, and the kiln has been fired and has cooled down enough to be unpacked. The clay at this stage is much stronger, as the particles have partly vitrified, fusing together, but not enough to prevent the pot from absorbing water, which is crucial for the glazing, as when these pots are dipped into a bucket of glaze, the porous body absorbs water, leaving a powdery layer of the raw materials on the outside. But I don't want the entire pot to be glazed, as otherwise it will stick to the kiln shelf during the firing. So to get around that, I brush some wax onto the base, although in this instance I so almost ruined it by accidentally letting wax drip onto the vase. Had it fallen a millimetre either way, it would have either flooded the foot or fallen onto the walls of the vase, both of which would have required either refiring the vessel, sanding the wax away, or blasting it with a heat gun, which leaves these terrible blackened scorch marks as the wax is burnt away, which I'm sure can never be good for the glazing, but it's equally not something I've tested enough to know for certain. Once the wax is dry, the glazing can begin. And if I don't glaze the foot ring first, like so, when the vase is dipped into the bucket, there's a chance an air bubble can be trapped in the footwell, which causes the glaze to not properly adhere to all of it. But this solution works. The pot is then dipped all the way up to the rim, whereupon it's held steadily for a couple of seconds, the water in the glaze being absorbed into the walls, and the larger particles that make up the glaze create a layer on the outside of the pot. To remove the excess off the foot, I rotate the pot a couple of times on the workbench, like so, which I thoroughly clean prior to this, so afterwards I can scrape away all this excess glaze and reuse it. It's now the following day, and the porous walls of the pot have dried out, which means I can now coat the inside, for which I'm using a glaze that will fire slightly lighter, which means there'll be a difference in tone between the outside and inside of this pot. The vessel is filled up roughly 2/3 of the way. It's then picked up, the glaze is carefully swirled around and poured out, and the sharp, flared rim on this piece stops the glaze from dribbling down the outside shape, meaning the pot will be easier to tidy up later on. Whether I glaze the inside first or the outside really depends on the shape and size of the pot. This particular glaze dries to a very fragile surface. Had I glazed the inside first, when it came to dunking the outside surface into the glaze, there's a chance that the pressure needed to submerge the vessel could damage the interior glaze, whereas I can handle the exterior glazed portion with a bit more care and attention. It's now the following day, and the glaze has dried out completely, leaving it powdery and soft. And so it's at this stage that I fettle over the shape, softening any stray drips, and generally just trying to make the surface as flush and even as I can. The rim is the most crucial point, as if too much glaze is left on this sharp point, it can fire into globular lumps, which create unpleasant thick spots, adding an irregularity to the rim, which, as the most focal point on this vessel, I so need it to be perfect. At the same time, it's so easy to make a mistake, as not only can the glaze just chip off, but if I remove too much from one spot, it creates a thin patch that will show once fired. All the excess dust that does fall off, I'll scrape into the basin you can see behind me, which, once full, is sieved back into the larger bucket of glaze that this pot was initially dipped into. The walls of this pot are otherwise glazed quite evenly, so there's not too much tidying up to do. Had I glazed this piece in one go by dipping it into the bucket with a pair of tongs, there's a chance I would have ended up with a messier surface, as this glaze has to go on thickly and it doesn't settle quickly. So I find by dipping the outside I'm able to achieve the neatest surface. And the last bit to tidy up is the foot, of course. This part needs to be scraped clean of glaze, and I also use a small sponge to wipe away and clean up the line where glaze and clay meet. It has to be crisp and even all the way around, especially as the clay here will be the only stoneware left bare on the entire vessel. So if I do a poor job tidying this part up, it really won't look very professional once fired. And the better and neater it is at this stage, the better it's going to look once fired. So it's really worth tending to your glazed pots. It's not a process you want to rush. The next step is to load the vase and all the other pots into my Roda KG 340 gas kiln. Unlike my other electric kiln, this one is fueled by mains gas, which gives me the ability to alter the atmosphere inside as they're being fired. I can decrease the amount of oxygen inside, which causes the iron present in the clay and glazes to act differently than it does when fired in oxidation, thus creating colours and textures that are quite difficult to achieve with an electric kiln. The following morning at 7 AM on the dot, the kiln is lit, with the door open, as if you light a gas kiln with the door closed, it can potentially cause an explosion, which wouldn't be the best way to start your firing. I take the temperature up slowly at the start, and every half hour I make a note of the time, temperature, the gas pressure, the air pressure, and the position of the dampers. Once the temperature reaches 860 degrees Celsius, I initiate the reduction atmosphere by sliding the dampers to be half closed and greatly increasing the gas and air pressure. Simply put, this causes too much gas to accumulate in the chamber, which means the fuel can't burn properly as there's not enough oxygen, and as a result, oxygen gets stripped away from the clay and glazes, and it's this which creates the blue and green tones that have come to characterise my work. Once the temperature reaches about 1290 degrees Celsius, or when cone 10 is touching toes, the kiln is switched off and then crash cooled back down to 1000 degrees Celsius. The pots are so almost finished, but from this point it takes about 2 days to cool down fully. And once the pyrometer reads about 100 degrees Celsius, I'll crack the kiln open and take the vase out. The glaze is pulled into a lovely thick layer around the rim, but truth be told, I'm not sure if I like the slight subtle tonal difference between the outside and inside. I think I should have done it the other way around, with the darker colour being coated on the interior. I'll have to try that next time. Now, as the clay fires, it shrinks around the coarse particles of grog the body contains, which means even though I burnished the bottom to be lovely and smooth at the leather hard stage, it's now slightly coarse, but a polish with a diamond pad quickly fixes it. And that's this vase finished. I love the severe angularity to it, but I think when I make some of these again, I'll add a bit more detail to the lip, such as a step or a ledge, just so the glaze has something else to interact with. The glazed foot is lovely though. I'm always glad when it works, as I've had a few glazed feet stick to the kiln shelves, as I've glazed them too thickly on that inner portion, so it has to be fettled back a bit more than I think. The trouble with a shape like this is that the thick glass that coats it ends up padding out the form somewhat, so some of the angularity is lost, especially on the lower half, but otherwise, I like it, and now all I want to do is scale this shape up using that crimson clay and glaze I've been experimenting with lately. So expect that video relatively soon. Otherwise, thanks so much for taking the time to watch, especially if you've made it this far to the end. And, as always, I'll see you next time.